This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 4 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm Dustin Chandry. So on the previous episode, we started the first of a 4-part series looking at targets and fades within both Dynasty and Redraft formats and breaking that into 4 separate quadrants. So the previous episode, you can check that out, featured 10 players that we were targeting in both Redraft and Dynasty. Those were 10 guys that I felt pretty strongly are going to outperform their ADP in a redraft standpoint, and because of that, you're going to see a pretty sharp increase in their Dynasty value. Now, today's episode, part 2 of this series, a little bit slightly different variation on that in terms of we're still going to target these 9 players from a redraft standpoint, but because of their age, their position, maybe some injury concerns, these are players that if you're not contending right now in Dynasty, you should be looking to sell given where their current value is. So this will be part 2 of our 4-part series. This will be redraft targets and Dynasty fades, and it'll obviously be pretty heavily concentrated at the running back position. So let's dive in. I got 6 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and 1 quarterback that you should be targeting in your redraft league. But if you're not a contender in Dynasty, you need to be looking to trade out right now. So let's dive in. So the first 2 running backs I want to focus on are 2 guys that if you are picking in your redraft league in a standard snake draft, you're picking in the back end of the first round, a 10 or 12 team league. These would be 2 guys I would be targeting with that early second round pick, and that'll be King Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans and then Tony Pollard of the Dallas Cowboys. So let's dig into Derrick Henry. So I mean, the concern from a dynasty standpoint is that he's 29 years old, and obviously he has a lot of mileage on him right now, but he has been not just one of the most consistent players, but consistently one of the most dominant players at his position in all of fantasy football. So if you look at the last 5 seasons, his PPR finishes within the position. Starting in 2018, he finished 15th, 5, 3rd, 21 in 2021, and then 4th last year. And even that 2021 season, he only played 8 games due to an injury, so he missed the last half of the season. But within 2021, that was actually his best season from a fantasy points per game scored standpoint. So he was actually first in points per game scored in that 8-game sample. But other than the 2021 season, this is a guy who's played 15 to 16 games every single season of his NFL career. On top of that, we really have not seen too significant of a drop-off in his performance the last few years, even given his age and his mileage. He's continuously averaged about 4.5 to 5 yards a carry for the last 4 seasons. He's consistently averaging about 20 points per game, right? He had 20 points per game in 2019, 21 in 2020. He had 23 points per game in half of the season in 2021, and then 19 points per game last year. And even as he gets a little bit older, what's interesting last year is his highest season ever from a target and a reception standpoint and receiving yards. So now he's adding even in a little bit extra receiving volume on top of the dominance that is his rushing production. And not only has Derrick Henry been dominant season to season, he's been dominant week to week and reliable in your lineup. Just last year, he scored 19 points a game. He played 16 games. But Henry went over 15 points in 10 of his 16 games last season. So almost 2 out of every 3 games, he's getting you at least 15 points. You look at that compared to other running backs in the league. I asked myself just how many running backs last year scored at least 15 points in half of their games played. That gave me a list of 11 running backs, 10 running backs who fit that profile. Again, Derrick Henry is approaching 2/3, so then I said, all right, let's increase that a little bit more. We pushed that up to running backs who scored 15 points on at least 60% of their games played. That only netted 4 running backs, which includes Derrick Henry. And then when you expand that a little bit more, all right, let's look at just how dominant he was in 2021 in half a season played and all of 2022. He was scoring at least 15 fantasy points in exactly 2/3 of his game plays. And the only other running backs in the last 2 years who fit that profile, at least 15 points in 60% of their games played for the last 2 seasons, there's 4 running backs: Derrick Henry, Austin Eckler, Christian McCaffrey, and Jonathan Taylor. Now, Taylor has his own issues right now from a contract standpoint with the Colts, but if you take those other 3 guys, Eckler and McCaffrey, those are 2 top 5, maybe even 2 top 3 picks right now in your redraft league. Derrick Henry's going in the back end of the first, more likely early second round, so historically, Henry should be in this group with Eckler and McCaffrey, but you're getting almost a whole round of value by drafting Henry as opposed to Eckler and McCaffrey. But the reason Henry is on today's podcast, the focus of this, is redraft targets. Derrick Henry is a top 5 running back, and quite frankly, I think he should be a first-round pick, even though from a ranking standpoint and an ADP standpoint, he is consistently going early second round. But he's a top 5 running back in redraft, but his dynasty value right now is running back 12. Again, he's going to be 30 years old by the end of the season. So he's in the last year of his contract with the Titans. He is the focal point of that offense, but after this year, there is great uncertainty as to what his future with the Titans will look like, where he'll be, what this offense will look like. So, yeah, he's a 1-year fill-in for a championship team. But if you're holding him right now in Dynasty and you're not confident that you're competing, you got to cash out now while he has a good amount of value. You should be getting at least a 2024 first or a young wide receiver who's equivalent to a 2024 first. So we can target Henry safely in redraft, late first, early second. But from a dynasty standpoint, if you're not contending, you need to be moving him right now. The next player right after Derrick Henry is Dallas running back Tony Pollard. So running back 7 overall, middle of the second round. You can get Tony Pollard a few picks after Derrick Henry. From a dynasty standpoint, he's a few rankings better than Derrick Henry right now at running back 10. Obviously, the separation being he's about 3 years younger than Derrick Henry right now. But the reason he's more of a dynasty sell if you're not contending is the fact, well, let's say it's twofold. One, we've never seen him in a workhorse role in his career. And the second, with his contract, he's on a 1-year franchise tag. There's no long-term guarantee that he is going to be tied to the Dallas offense beyond this year. So obviously that poses a lot of risk from a dynasty standpoint. But we love him, obviously, from a redraft standpoint, right? Ezekiel Elliott has moved on, and I think the statistics bear out quite a bit of optimism going into this season. Last year, Tony Pollard played 16 games. He was running back 8 on the season. It looks like on a week-to-week basis, he had 6 weeks where he was inside the top 8 in running back running back fantasy points scored for those weeks. But what's obviously amazing about that is that he did that production on far fewer touches than you would see other running backs in the top 10, right? He only had 548 total snaps last season. You look at all the other running backs in the top 10, they're somewhere more in the 6 to 750 snap count range. Tony Pollard didn't even break 550 last season. Not only was his snap count the lowest among all the top 10 running backs, but his share of snaps was also the lowest among all the top 10 running backs from last year. In fact, he didn't even break 50% of running back snaps on his own team. He had 45.6% of all running back snaps on the Dallas offense last year went to Tony Pollard. A lot of the other top running backs are at least breaking 50%, and many of them are well over 60%. Saquon Barkley, for example, at 63%. Austin Eckler was at 55% on the highest snap volume that there was 710. Christian McCaffrey had over 70% of the snaps when he was with Carolina, and that dropped down to 59% when he was with the Niners. And then the highest one, Josh Jacobs had 83.5% of the running back snaps for the Raiders last year. Obviously, significantly more points for Jacobs compared to Pollard. But again, that just illustrates the fact that Tony Pollard was, on a snap basis compared to how many fantasy points he scored, he was an electric running back. And if you look at Pollard's fantasy points scored divided by how many snaps he played, he ranks in the top 10 on that metric as well, right? He scored 0.454 fantasy points per snap. So, right, he's scoring half a point every single snap he's on the field. That put him 8th overall in the league. Some other guys in the top 10, obviously Austin Eckler, Breece Hall was there before he got injured. Jamal Williams, just because he scored so many touchdowns. DeAndre Swift is in there. Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, Nick Chubb, right? And it's a pretty exclusive list of elite running backs that Tony Pollard is a part of. And simply by increasing his snap count and his share this season with Ezekiel Elliott out of the way, he is going to be well worth that middle of the second round where he is currently valued at from an ADP standpoint. And then once you get past round 2, in the next round, there's another running back that I like. And I can't believe I'm actually saying this because I've kind of faded him the last few years, but I think Joe Mixon of the Cincinnati Bengals right now in the middle of round 3 has to be considered a pretty good value from a redraft standpoint. Right now he's running back 11, middle of the third round. And then from a dynasty standpoint, he's at running back 24 now. There's a big mass, if you will, of running backs that I think are similarly valued somewhere between, maybe 18 to 26, and Mixon is kind of in that group. So you could probably rearrange a lot of those guys in there. But right now, I would much rather have, even in Dynasty, I'd much rather have Mixon ahead of guys like, Miles Sanders, Cam Akers, DeAndre Swift, Alvin Kamara. A lot of these guys who are going to kind of be in that same tier, if you will, if you could flip Mixon just straight up for another team that maybe would want a younger player, that would typically be a good spot. But, just talking about Mixon from from a redraft standpoint with his ADP, look, he is the only player in this round 3 range that is the workhorse back on an elite offense. And it really is as simple as that. Some other players right around him, Najee Harris, running back 10, inferior offense. I think Jaylen Warren is going to cut into his work. Travis Etienne right behind him at running back 12. It's a good offense, but not as good as Cincinnati. I certainly do not think he will get anywhere near the snap share that Joe Mixon will get with the Bengals. Ramondre Stevenson right after him, great PPR back, doesn't get much work along the goal line, which is why the Pats brought in Zeke Elliott, Jahmyr Gibbs at running back 14. I think very similar story where he's going to dominate from a PPR standpoint, but I think the Lions have David Montgomery earmarked for that goal line role. So Joe Mixon is the only guy in that round 3 range as a running back that I would even want to target from a redraft standpoint. And then I think from a dynasty standpoint, I think you're getting good value for this season. But beyond this season, right, they reworked his contract. I think there were concerns that he may not even come back. There were some legal concerns in there as well. But I would be somewhat surprised if Joe Mixon is back with the Bengals next year. So he's most likely going from a situation where he's the workhorse back on a great offense to, he's probably the lead back in more of a committee format. And then he's probably downgrading from an elite offense to an average offense or a poor offense, maybe something like what Miles Sanders did, going from the Eagles to the Panthers this season. So Mixon, great value in redraft this season, but if you have him right now in a dynasty league, I think you're going to see a pretty sharp decrease in his value by the end of the season. Another running back right behind Mixon, then once you get into the early to mid fourth round, I like Aaron Jones of the Packers. Right now, let's see, running back 15, early fourth round in redraft from a dynasty standpoint. I have him at running back 20, but again, he's right in that kind of mass of running backs who are kind of in that late teen to mid 20 range, where a lot of these guys are going to be valued kind of in the same tier. So again, Aaron Jones is running back 15 right now in redraft ADP, but all this guy has done for the last 4 seasons consistently has been a top 10 running back dating back to 2019. His PPR fantasy point finishes 2nd, 5th, 10th, and 9th last year. And again, this is a guy who's now running back 15 on this upcoming season. And I think if last year was any indication, we really should not be afraid of A.J. Dillon cutting into Aaron Jones' workload and his fantasy production. So last year, if you compare these two side by side, Aaron Jones played more snap. His snap share was 52.6% compared to A.J. Dillon was at 45% for the running back position within Green Bay. Aaron Jones scored almost 3-2. He had 60% to 40% of the fantasy points scored for the running back position within Green Bay. Receiving targets, 63% to 37% in favor of Aaron Jones. Rushing carries, closer to 50-50, but Aaron Jones had 52% compared to 46% for A.J. Dillon. Total touchdowns scored, they both scored 7 touchdowns. So Aaron Jones is on the field more. He's getting more targets. He's still getting a slightly higher share of even rushing attempts. He's scoring a fair number of touchdowns. Obviously, all that adds up to a very reliable running back 2 that you can get in the middle of 4th round. And then the last 2 running backs that I have here to kind of finish out this section. Very similar narrative, which is why they're right next to one another in both ADP and Dynasty. That's Minnesota running back Alexander Mattison and Arizona running back James Conner. Right now, 60 and 61 overall in ADP, running back 21 and 22 in position rankings. We're talking late 5th or the 6th round, typically in your redraft snake drafts. And then from a Dynasty standpoint, they're going to go a little bit later than that. James Conner running back 29, Alexander Mattison running back 30. So I think both these guys really just come down to the fact that these are, let's just say, average to below average quality running backs by NFL standards, of course, that are in just very good situations right now, right? They are the clear alphas, the clear running back 1s. They're going to get a vast majority of the carries, opportunities, and everything that flows with that. However, I think it's very likely that both of these guys will not be a starting running back come this time next year. Obviously, James Conner has done well the last 2 seasons. Actually, he was running back 5 overall 2 years ago. That was driven by he had a very high touchdown number. Last year, he regressed a little bit more. I think he was running back 20, which is about where he is right now. In ADP this year, so I think that's appropriate for him. Mattison's a guy who's been a career backup behind Dalvin Cook, finally getting his opportunity. He's been good in small samples where Cook has been out, but we have no long-term track record with Alexander Mattison being able to carry the load for an entire season. So I like both these guys where they're currently going from an ADP on the redraft side. If you could unload either one of these guys in Dynasty for a future first, that's a quick accept. I was actually able to unload Alexander Mattison about a month ago for a 2025 first for a team that I think is kind of middle of the road right now. So those are 2 guys that I think can help you as your running back 2 if you wait a while in your redraft league, potentially running back 3. And then guys, if you're not contending right now, you should be moving Conner and Mattison off your rosters while they still have some value and you can get something for them. So flipping to wide receiver, I have 2 veteran wide receivers that obviously have significant value from a redraft standpoint, but due to their age, they're declining dynasty asset. The first one is easily my favorite dynasty target if you are in need of a wide receiver, one that can lift you into contending status, and that is Keenan Allen of the LA Chargers. Currently ADP in redraft, number 40 overall, wide receiver 18. We're talking early to middle of the fourth round. So that's wide receiver 18 in redraft. And then from a dynasty standpoint, he is wide receiver 28 in dynasty rankings. And all this guy has done historically has just been a top 10, top 15 producer. Up until last season, he's regularly played 16 games each season, dating back to 2017. His PPR finishes among all wide receivers 3rd, 12th, 6th, 14th, 10th, and then last year he finished 42nd on 10 games played. So if you take him on a points scored per game average, he would have had another top 20 season last year just on points scored per game. And even that was a little fluky, his last year stats, because he got hurt week 1 with the hamstring injury, missed so much time, tried to come back in week 7, only played about a third of the snaps, and then he tried to ramp up from week 11 on. So if you only take maybe week 12 through week 18, where he played at least 70% of the snaps in those games, he was wide receiver 8 on the season, another top 10 season when he's healthy and he's on the field. This is an enormous value you can get in the early fourth round of a redraft standpoint, and then a wide receiver 28, a guy you could pretty cheaply go out and get that can instantly elevate you into a contender in your dynasty league this year. And then the other guy is Tampa wide receiver Mike Evans. He's going about a round later than Allen, 66th overall, wide receiver 27, middle of the 6th round for Mike Evans in ADP redraft. And then from a dynasty standpoint, wide receiver 34, so a few spots lower in dynasty value compared to Keenan Allen. And again, this is just a guy who historically has always produced. Obviously, we know he's getting older, but the guy's been in the league now since 2014, and every single year he's been a top 20 wide receiver in PPR totals. He plays 15, 16 games every single season. He's a red zone monster. He's just reliable, and he kind of just flies under the radar at this point, I think mainly because of his age. There's so much depth at the wide receiver position. I know a lot of people are scared about Baker Mayfield being named the starter on this team, but Evans and Godwin have historically always produced, regardless of who their quarterback has been. They don't have a lot of depth behind them. They're going to be a high route participation, high target share. These guys have very safe floors compared to where they're going right now. So both those guys I like from a redraft standpoint. And, very, very similar narrative from a dynasty standpoint, that both these guys are over the age of 30. I think both these guys are probably in their last year with their respective teams. Obviously, Allen reworked his contract to stay with the Chargers. Evans on the last year of his deal. Bucks are probably leaning towards a rebuild, if I had to guess. So I don't think Evans will be back next year. So I think these are guys that you can get pretty cheaply from a dynasty standpoint that can put you into a contender status. But outside of this year, if you are not contending right now and you have these guys on your roster, you should be looking to unload and get what you can for the future. And then my last player, the lone quarterback that I have in this group, is Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. Right now, his ADP for redraft would be quarterback 13, so kind of a fringe quarterback 1 as we enter this season. He's going late 8th, early 9th round. So again, quarterback 13 in redraft, and very similarly, he is quarterback 14 in terms of his dynasty ranking right now, but he has fallen a little bit here this off season. And I think the fear that we have with Tua from a dynasty standpoint is pretty apparent, and that is his health. Obviously he has had significant concussion concerns. Obviously the game against, I think it was the Bengals, where he had that really scary concussion. This offseason he has been open about the fact that he contemplated retirement even at the age of 25. So it's kind of a scary situation that this is a guy who could be one more concussion away from having to hang it up in an instance. And he hasn't really played that many games on each year. His rookie year, he only played 10 games, 2021 and 2022. He only played 13 games each. And his average points per game isn't that high either. In 2021, he only scored about 16 points a game. Last year, he was at 18 points a game. So it's kind of middle of the road. He obviously, he's had a few spike weeks in there, but for a guy that has this injury risk, where he could be out of the league with one more concussion, and the fact that he's not an elite quarterback from a production standpoint, I think that's a player that we should be concerned about from a dynasty standpoint. And then from a redraft standpoint, Tua's kind of in this fringe quarterback one group. Once you kind of get outside the 8th round, we start talking about Rodgers and Tua and Anthony Richardson, Geno Smith, Daniel Jones. All these guys I think are kind of grouped right there together. So I think Tua is appropriately ranked if Tua is the guy that you like, and you can kind of add him in combination with like an Anthony Richardson, Geno Smith, Daniel Jones. I like that strategy from a redraft standpoint if you're the last one, kind of waiting to go on quarterback. But I think you have to consider the fact that obviously the risk is there that he can miss games. We talked about the fact that he only averaged 18 points a game last season. Now, if you exclude the games that he got hurt in, that he played less than 40 snaps in, his fantasy points per game jumps to 20.3, which is good, not great. And then I kind of also asked myself, of the games where he played at least 40 snaps, what percent of those did he break 25 points, which is kind of the marker I like to hit from a quarterback standpoint. He only hit that mark 18% of the time. Less than 1 out of 5 games was he above 25%, even when he was playing 40 snaps. So that doesn't really put him in elite company with that stat. We're talking. So that 18% marker kind of puts him in that same tier of guys like, interesting enough, Aaron Rodgers, Jared Goff, Russell Wilson, Kirk Cousins, Daniel Jones. Those are the sort of guys, and again, they're in the same range of that ADP, where you're going to get maybe a few spike weeks in there, but for the most part, you can pretty consistently bank on around 18 to 22 points. Cross your fingers that he doesn't get hurt in any of those games. So I think he's appropriately valued from a redraft standpoint, but again, if you have him on your roster right now in Dynasty, especially Superflex Dynasty, you should be looking to move him before another injury could basically end his career in an instance. So that'll wrap up episode 4 of the Dynasty Alchemist podcast. Please hit subscribe, or you can find us on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. If you like this series, like I said, make sure to hit subscribe. The next quadrant we will be covering is actually kind of my favorite to talk about, and those are Dynasty targets but redraft fades, players who we like the talent, but they're not going to help you this year in redraft, but long term they're excellent Dynasty targets. So if that appeals to you, make sure you hit subscribe, and we'll have that episode out here in the next few days. So for Dustin Chandry signing off, thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.